Hello, and welcome to Aviation Deep Dive. The Swedish film Första Divisionen, or First Division, was released in September 1941. The backdrop to the story is provided by political realities of the time, with Sweden penned in by countries occupied by Nazi Germany. The story itself ramps up the excitement by showing how Air Force commanders were responding to the encirclement by hostile powers by encouraging their squadrons to drive men and machine to breaking point in the struggle to construct a credible national defense and maintain Sweden's watchful neutrality. Death is their constant companion and camaraderie their only friend. There is enthusiastic singing from a male voice choir, a lot of tracking shots of the Swedish landscape, and some excellent footage of many of the Swedes' 94 Northrop A-17 bombers flying in formation and attacking not very much at all. For all that its inappropriately jaunty music and stilted dialogue make Första Divisionen a forgettable cinematic footnote, there is a certain amount of truth behind all the pencil moustaches and immaculately tailored uniforms. Sweden did find itself penned in. Norway and Denmark, to the west and south respectively, were occupied by Nazi Germany. Finland, to the east, would also strike up an alliance of expediency with the Nazis against the Soviet Union. In the face of this, Sweden's neutrality was very fragile indeed. The country had decided that it would be neutral when war broke out in September 1940, but said that it was non-belligerent in the conflict between Finland and the Soviet Union. This term was deliberately chosen instead of neutral, as it allowed the Swedes to provide direct military help to the Finns, including pilots and aircraft. One unit, F-19, was wholly manned by Swedish volunteers and flew in the Winter War. A transit agreement signed with Germany in June 1940, under some duress, allowed troops and supplies to pass between Norway and Finland. Sweden continued to export goods to both sides, including ball bearings which were ferried to British ports by converted motor torpedo boats eluding the German blockade. But even with concessions to the Germans and a carefully maintained relationship with the Allies, the Swedes' situation seemed eternally uncertain. In particular, the years during which the Germans were in the ascendancy made the Swedes fear that their demands would soon be for more than raw materials and railway access. Hi, just a quick word before we get back to the video. You can skip by clicking on the timestamp on screen now. If you enjoy the videos we make and value the research and information, please consider subscribing or becoming a member of our Patreon. A sad reality of making historical documentaries is that sometimes YouTube blacklists videos for having dark or grisly content, but of course we're talking about war, so that's always going to be a factor in our videos. For example, our last video on the Stuka in the Spanish Civil War got blacklisted for having info on Stukas bombing civilian targets, and as a result it's got very little views. So yeah, please consider subscribing or joining our Patreon. If you can't, no worries, just even watching our videos is a huge support in itself. So thank you, and back to the video. In the words of Georg Homan, a member of the General Staff, without a defensive force we cannot follow any policy of our own. Our declarations become merely empty words and we leave the country's fate to chance, or to the decisions of others. With the defense as strong as Swedish conditions allow, we secure for ourselves the basis of a continued independent Swedish policy. Providing the air component of this defense would prove to be difficult. As the Northrop A-17s in 1st Division suggest, the Swedes had been heavily reliant on the American aircraft industry. The A-17s had all been built under license by Saab, and in Swedish service it was known as the B-5. Saab were also producing the North American NA-16, known to the Swedes as the SK-14. They had also ordered 120 Seversky P-35s, following a demonstration by Alexander de Seversky, known by the export designation EP-1 for Export Pursuit, but an embargo placed by the US in October 1940 on all exports of war material to all countries other than the UK disrupted the order, and ended American exports entirely. 20 EP-1s reached Sweden via Norwegian ports before the German occupation of Norway halted deliveries. The rest of the order had to be redirected to the Finnish port of Petsamo, and even then, its onward journey was disrupted by damage from Soviet bombing to the area around the port. Only prodigious effort at rebuilding shattered road links got the crates containing the aircraft to nearby Haparanda in Sweden, where they could be taken by rail to Malmen and then reassembled. In Swedish, jakt means hunting, so according to the Swedish naming convention for aircraft, where jakt is abbreviated to J, they served as J9s. It demonstrated how hard acquiring aircraft was going to be. The only country happy to sell to them now was fascist Italy, who provided the Swedes with aircraft that looked the part, but which proved to be disappointing. The Fiat CR42 was badly built, accident-prone, and had an open cockpit, which was not ideal for harsh Swedish winters. The Reggiane RE 2000 Falco fighter was sturdy enough but unreliable. There were also brief discussions with the Japanese air attaché about acquiring Mitsubishi Zero aircraft, which were thoroughly derailed by the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Oddly enough, the Zero comes up again in this story. Saab had proposed a fighter aircraft to be called the J-19, which looked a lot like the Nordic version of the Zero, and would have gone into production were it not for the outbreak of the war in 1939. It was based on a design by Bristol, and was an all-metal, low-winged aircraft that had a retractable undercarriage, 4 wing-mounted 13.2mm machine guns, and an estimated top speed of 375 miles an hour. It became clear that the Bristol Taurus engine that was going to be its power plant would not be supplied by the British, who now had very different priorities, and the Swedish Zero never flew off the drawing board. Saab would have been the natural candidates to revisit the idea of a locally made fighter, but they had moved on, and were now busily making their B-18 bomber and B-17 dive bomber. They did not have the spare capacity needed to work on any new aircraft. General Niels Soldeberg was the member of the armed forces tasked with aircraft procurement, and came up with an elegant solution to the problem of building an indigenous fighter to get around the problem with imports while not burdening Saab. The Swedes would simply start a new organization who could do the design and development work, with a separate factory being built to make the fighter. Accordingly, the
Flygförvaltningens flygverkstad i Stockholm,
the Aeronautical Flight Workshop in Stockholm to English speakers, or FFVS, was formed to make the prototype, having first promised Saab that they would not take any designers, materials, or industrial capacity away from them. But there were other requirements which were equally hard to satisfy. The new aircraft would have to be built without duralumin, a lightweight yet strong alloy of aluminium and copper used in aircraft construction, since Saab needed access to all the available supplies. This meant it would have to use alternative methods of construction, and would also have to make use of the Pratt & Whitney R1830 Twin Wasp, as this was the most powerful engine that the Swedes had access to. The reason for this was that the engine was already being imported, but the embargo in October 1940 had stopped any more from arriving, although 115 were bought from the Vichy French regime through Germany in June 1943, there would still not be enough for the various aircraft that Sweden needed to build. To make good the shortfall, Swedish company Svenska Flygmotor at Trollhättan decided to reverse engineer them from an original engine. This necessitated producing completely new production drawings and managing the conversion from imperial measurements to metric, as well as making the machinery used to manufacture the various parts of the engine, now known as an STWC3. The Swedes maintained that the new hybrid engine had a superior performance to the original, but whatever the truth of this, 567 examples were ordered. The process was ingenious, and because no license had been paid for or granted by Pratt & Whitney, completely illegal. When Pratt & Whitney found out after the war, a delegation was sent from Svenska Flygmotor to pay for whatever the engine maker saw as an appropriate sum. Impressed by the Swedes' honesty, they charged them just $1 and invited them to choose anything else that they needed. Apparently unable to think of anything, the Swedes returned home. But several years later, on realizing that they needed a classroom to be fitted out, asked Pratt & Whitney if they might like to help. The American company duly paid for all necessary equipment. For performance, the new aircraft would be intended to achieve a similar top speed to the contemporary models of the Messerschmitt 109 and the Spitfire. So in summary, the Swedes would need to create a fighter around a decent but fairly unspectacular engine that had gone into production 10 years before, using neither existing industrial capacity nor one of the main materials used in aircraft manufacture, and have it equal the performance of two fighter aircraft which had none of these restraints placed on them. And to do all of this using a new company, a new factory, and a new design team. The designer chosen to lead on this mammoth task was Bo Lundberg, a pilot and aeronautical engineer who had previously worked at Svarman Workshops and Götaverken. And Götaverken are notable because they were the company who had license-built 3 Hawker Harts, 14 examples of the rear wing 9000L Sportster light aircraft, and 12 Fiat CR-42 Falco fighters, as well as 16 Fiat G50 fighters and 9 Westland Lysanders for Finland. Lundberg had also overseen the attempted procurement of over 140 Vultee Vanguard aircraft, which had run foul of the American arms embargo. He already had a design for a fighter that he'd worked on called the GP9. This was dusted off, looked at again, reworked, and soon to be known as Project P22. The process began in November 1940 in an apartment in Stockholm, and Lundberg was later joined by several designers who would become well known, including Lars Breising from Saab, who would become famous for designing the Saab 29 Tunnan jet fighter shortly after the end of the war. A memo by Lundberg, written at the time, read, "The design and manufacturing must by all means possible be expedited. For the development there will be a substantial design office and an experimental shop. Due to present circumstances, it would be suitable if the development could be located at Saab. The 2 prototypes and the first 3 to 5 production aircraft should be manufactured by Saab. The production manufacturing should be farmed out to a large number of subcontractors and mechanical shops and carpentries. The final assembly should be performed by a number of different shops and airport facilities which will have the necessary assembly space. To achieve the necessary quality and tolerances, it would be suitable if Saab manufactured the master tooling from which other tooling can be derived." But with Saab sidelined at their own request, Lundberg would not get everything he wanted, although much of what he outlined would indeed be provided or organized, particularly the use of a dispersed array of expert workshops. His design consisted of a fuselage which had a tubular chrome and molybdenum steel construction with a covering of molded beech plywood panels that were also part of the load-bearing structure. These panels were joined by glued strips of fabric, allowing for their expansion and contraction with rising and falling temperatures, and a similar technique was used on the wing. While this technique was never again used on aircraft, a similar system is now used in composite carbon fiber builds. The landing gear was attached to the main spar of the wing and designed so that it pivoted at 90 degrees and tucked back into the fuselage in a manner reminiscent of the P-40. It made a strong assembly and left the wing itself free of the bulky mechanisms needed to retract the wheels, and so avoided the need for any additional strengthening. The narrow width of the undercarriage made for a joke amongst Swedish pilots. They said that the line which had been fed to the press, which insisted that this was the fastest aircraft in the world relative to engine power, should have been that it was the fastest aircraft in the world relative to the width of its undercarriage track. To keep Saab happy and avoid using any manpower or supplies associated with the conventional aircraft industry, around 500 of the components were built by Lundberg's desired network of subcontractors, ranging from small businesses to large industries. Bringing all these together was not as easy as anyone thought, and the workforce at the FFVA would expand from 100 to 800 people. Svenska Möbelfabriken, a furniture company in Bodafors, was one of the factories that produced the wooden panels from Finnish birch. The 7-meter-long wing spar was made by AGA, better known for their gas cookers. It had to be machined to within a tolerance of 2 millimeters at the tip, and a special welding technique had to be developed to prevent the metal from distorting due to the stress in the welding joints. Final assembly was carried out at a maintenance hangar at Bromma Airport in Stockholm, leased from state-owned airliner Aktiebolaget Aerotransport, today part of the SAS, by the Swedish Air Force for as long as it was needed. The final 18 airframes were built by the Flygvapnet itself in its workshops at Arboga to the east of Stockholm, after striking factory workers at Bromma left the government with nowhere else to build its fighters. The prototype of P-22, serial number 22001, was completed a year later. It resembled an early version of the Focke-Wulf FW190 with its razorback radial engine and outsized spinner, intended to help engine cooling while reducing weight. But while the fully loaded FW190A8 weighed in at around 4,900 kilograms, the J22 was significantly lighter and weighed no more than 2,800 kilograms at its heaviest, even though it was of a roughly comparable size. And while the P-22 might not have been as sophisticated as the FW190, it was promised to be far in advance of other fighters serving with the Flygvapnet, and would later prove to be very popular with its pilots. Taxiing trials started on September 18, 1942, and the prototype first flew from Bromma 2 days later in a 40-minute flight with Major Olaf Enderlein, chief of the Air Force Test Center, as the pilot. The aircraft did not last long, however. It crashed on June 19, 1943 during flight trials, plunging almost vertically into the ground near Torresta and burying itself 3 meters deep. Its pilot, Bar Johan Salwin, was killed instantly. Salwin had previously served as a fighter pilot with F-19, the expatriate Swedish unit that flew with the Finns during the Winter War. He had downed 3 aircraft while flying a Gloster Gladiator, including an I-15 BIS and 2 Tupolev SB-2s, one of which was the first of the type brought down by F-19, and damaged a further 2, winning the Finnish Order of the Cross of Liberty in the process. Since he was clearly a highly experienced pilot, exactly what caused the crash is uncertain, but some sources suggest oxygen starvation as a possible cause. Whatever the reason, Salwin left behind a wife and a daughter. The second prototype crashed a while later after engine failure at low altitude, with its pilot Bengt Carlsen surviving, albeit with injuries. Neither crash was enough to derail the program, and the new aircraft soon received the official designation J22, since 60 orders had been placed even before its first flight. The first production aircraft flew in August 1943, with deliveries starting to the F-9 wing of the Flygvapnet, who were previously based in the southern city of Gothenburg, in October. Since the unit had previously flown the aging Fiat CR-42, the J-22 was particularly welcome. While most aircraft run through several versions, the J-22 would only have 2. The J-22A had 2 7.9mm machine guns and 2 13.2mm cannon, while the J-22B would have 4 cannon. 9 aircraft were equipped for reconnaissance duties with a bulky vertically mounted camera in the tail at some point during 1946, and dubbed the S-22. This designation used the first letter of Spanning, which means reconnaissance in Swedish, but they were converted back again the following year. In the meantime, deliveries continued to F-9, and in 1944, the F-19 wing based just north of Stockholm in Uppsala became the second wing to become equipped with the J-22. Other wings followed suit over the coming years, and every wing in the Flygvapnet would fly it at some point. One of the most commonly cited interviews is with Ove Muller Hansen, a squadron commander with the 2nd Squadron at F-10 wing in Ängelholm, carried out by Swedish pilot and aviation enthusiast Håkan Langerbo. This was one of the finest aircraft that I have ever flown. The responsiveness of the controls and overall handling was exceptionally nice. It was not a high-altitude fighter, but up to about 5,000 meters it could hold its own very well. We flew mock dogfights with P-51 Mustangs, and they could not catch us below 4,000 meters. But if the fight was higher than that, then we had to be very careful. At altitudes above 6,000 meters, it was getting sluggish, and at 9,000 meters there was not much power left. Stalls and turns in flying straight were usually not a problem, but if you pulled really hard in turn, it would sometimes flip over onto its back. The first version, the J-22A, did not have much firepower, but the J-22B was better. Muller Hansen is also seemingly the only J-22 pilot who engaged an enemy aircraft. He would later remember, "I was over Malmö Harbour when I had a fight in my J-22 with a Heinkel HE-111. He was shooting at me and I was shooting at him, trying to make him leave Swedish territory. I finally got him smoking. He was probably on his way to Copenhagen, but I don't think he made it as he was losing altitude. I saw an aircraft behind me and I thought it was a FW190, as they were also stationed in Copenhagen, and I pulled away as much as I could and was able to lose him. It turned out that it was my wingman. He was a little late taking off, so he was rather far behind me. The J-22 was very similar to the FW190, so it was difficult to tell them apart. We were really scared of the FW190. We could probably outturn them, but we really didn't want to try. My wingman was a little angry at me after this incident, but I told him what happened and he understood. Julius Hagander was a pilot with the same unit who had similarly fond memories of his days flying the J-22. Compared to the advanced trainer we were used to, the SK-14, it was like a piece of butter in a hot pan, a real hot rod. We flew against P-51 Mustangs, and we could easily outturn them, but above 5,000 to 6,000 meters it was poor in performance. Once I tried to take it up as high as possible, and I reached 13,000 meters, and that was probably the highest anyone has ever flown a J-22. It was below the red line of the airspeed indicator, so I was basically stalling the aircraft. I was flying over the southern coast of Sweden, over Ystad, and I could see the northern coast of Germany. The throttle had a detent in it which you could override to get combat power. I remember when flying as number 2 in a 2-aircraft formation, if the number 1 aircraft was using full power, we often had to go to combat power to keep up, especially in a turn. The regulations said that if we went to combat power, we had to report it and have the engine inspected, but we rarely did as we used it so often. It was an aircraft that was very easy to fly. It was a bit sensitive in crosswind takeoffs and landings, and some pilots had problems with the narrow wheelbase, but I didn't think it was much to worry about. In total, 198 were built, with the final one being delivered on the 6th of April 1946, but by then, Europe and America were at peace. Finland had signed an armistice with the Soviet Union, and Sweden was no longer surrounded by enemies, but by allies. It could now access fighters from the world beyond its borders. The North American P-51 Mustangs that Muller Hansen and Hagander had fought mock dogfights with had a performance that was largely superior to that of the J-22, and helped the Flygvapnet fill the gap before the advent of the first jet fighters, such as the de Havilland Vampire, the Saab J-21R, and Lars Breitsching's Saab J-21 Tunnan. It meant that the J-22 aged quickly and was soon swept from the skies over Sweden by the Q plan, which sought to replace aging, propeller-driven aircraft with jets as quickly as possible. It was F3 at Malmslätt who were the last unit to fly the J-22, finally retiring them in 1952, 9 years after their first delivery to frontline squadrons. Those J-22s, which had not crashed or been written off, 66 of them were during their brief service life, ended up as ground targets, having their birch plywood panels flayed by cannon shells or blown to splinters by bombs. The result is that only 3 airframes have survived. 2 are owned by the Flygvapnet Museum in Malmö near Linköping. Red L, a J-22B with serial number 22280 in the markings of F3 wing, is kept on static display. But Red K, a J-22A with the serial number 22185 in the markings of the F-10 wing, is kept at Ängelholm and can still taxi under its own power. A third is at a Flygmuseum south of Falkenberg, where it is being restored jointly with Warbirds of Sweden and French-based Memorial Flight, but the schedule has been interrupted by the coronavirus. While it never shot down another aircraft, unless Obermuller Hansen's Heinkel did fail to make it back to base, the J22 entered history on its own terms. Nobody can ever know if it really did deter invasion, but it certainly kept Swedish skies free from incursion, and gave sharper teeth to its officially mandated policy of neutrality than the aging Italian imports could hope to do. More importantly, it was part of a blossoming of domestic manufacturing that gave the Swedish aircraft industry a dramatic boost. Svenska Flygmotor became Volvo Aero, and later the main engine supplier of the Flygvapnet. Saab used the talent unearthed by the country's brief isolation to work on a range of unorthodox but brilliant aircraft that used highly idiosyncratic solutions to problems, and the company remains an important part of the domestic economy. If the hallmark of a great design is that it performs its chosen task brilliantly and with the flair of the true original, then the J22 deserves to be seen as a truly great design. A huge thanks to my patrons on screen now for supporting the channel, and thank you so much for watching this video of Aviation Deep Dive. Consider liking and subscribing for more weekly content, and please also consider supporting us on Patreon. See you in the skies.